Thank you. And thank you to Professor Kim and to UNAI for hosting this forum. I'm very happy to be here. I happened to be in Tokyo yesterday and had an opportunity to come and spend time with all of you, and I'm very happy to do so before heading back home. By the way, I barely made it here altogether in that we had a terrible snowstorm in New York the day that I was leaving, and I managed to get out, and then an hour later they closed the airport. So I'm happy I got here altogether. As already described, the book talk today will be really focused on some elements within the book, but then some pieces that have occurred in the 2 years that have subsequently transpired. And I'd like to give a lot of opportunity for us to have conversations about this idea of GSED. It is a compelling one in many regards, mainly because, for me, of the seriousness with which we face global issues and the impact that they have now on our daily lives. So in terms of its significance, I think it's hard to overstate. And yet, just as it is very significant, it's also marginalized, and there's the kind of paradox within it, which is you don't see a lot of academic programs. You see a few, but you don't see a lot of academic programs, either in higher ed or in K-12 education, that are addressing GSED. And yet it's the urgency of the matter that seems to me that it should be a high-profile subject area. And it's where I've sort of put down my marker in my life to do this kind of work because I feel its importance is very significant. I believe that 100 years from now, people will look back on this era and say, how could they know so much and have done so little to address the global problems that they confronted? And yet, that's the reality that we face. And so today I want to talk about some of the highlights in places around the world where the work is going on, and also share insights with you that are generated from those places. In particular, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the conceptual pieces of what GSED constitutes. I'll then move into talking briefly about some examples. I'll spend most of my time in university examples, because I think that's most appropriate for all of you, although I'll spend a bit of time in K-12 and also in community-based initiatives that are GSED. And the very fact that we have community-based initiatives, I think in some ways, like a UNAI, is significant. It suggests that education has not taken up its role in doing GSED work. And lastly, I'll offer some broad insights about this idea of everyday transcendence and try to give you some color to what that means in the book, and then what it means for me personally and how it's affected and influenced the way that I live and the kind of work that I do. So let's get on with it. Some conceptual dimensions. Let me begin with my own personal story. You probably can't pick me out. Maybe you can, I don't know. I'm that young guy up there, right? So this is the beginning of my teaching career, my second year of teaching. And I use this as an explanation for our new teacher candidates as to why they shouldn't be a teacher, because I'm like, you'll look like this one day, and then the next day you'll look like this. So there's a lot of years between then and now. But this was a very profound moment for me personally and for these kids. We were in the early 1990s on the backside of the Cold War. Russia had disintegrated, the Soviet Union had disintegrated, and we were on an exchange program with a school in St. Petersburg, Russia, which had just been renamed. And in fact, I attended the first Easter Mass in the St. Petersburg Cathedral that had been held publicly since 1917. So this was a very momentous time. These young people were there on exchange. They were in a very elite school that we are exchanging with. We were there for a month. I was with teachers for a month. I was living in the home of Dima Milkov and his wife Zhenya Milkov, who I'm still in touch with thanks to the wonders of Facebook. They lived on Vasilostrovka, which is an island that's just in St. Petersburg, near the White Palace if you've been. It was a profound experience for me because I got to experience the kind of otherness of being in a completely foreign environment for a long period of time, and yet seeing the universality of the condition of life in that situation. We were leaving the school after a month of being together, not a dry eye on the bus, as I vividly recall, and I remember the flight home thinking, this is the work I want to do the rest of my career, because it had a profound impact on me and obviously on the students as well. They came, the exchange continued for years after, that kind of international work that we've all done. Again, it was the orienting thing, and it was the foundation for me. I was teaching this, and it was one thing to learn about it academically. It was another thing to experience it in the life of other people. So I start with that. I also then start with this, which I call the wall of doom, right? These are the global issues that we were talking about. So whether it's refugee crises, the extreme and grinding poverty that exists in the world today, climate change, obviously inundations and floods, terrorism, viral diseases, et cetera, right? These are all issues that know no boundary, right? So it's not enough for South Korea, the United States, or any other state to engage them alone. They alone will not be significant to address them. So we need concerted action, right? And we have organizations like UNAI, like the UN, its host organization, and others that try to do this work on a global level. And yet, the disjuncture of our time is we have an economic system that is integrated, and we have a political system that is disaggregated. And that is the friction point, right? So we are all about the neoliberal sort of market-based economy that allows us to take our cell phones and invest, let's say, in the Brazilian stock market. And yet the politics hasn't caught up with that. And it's most evident perhaps in regard to refugees and immigrants, right, or migrants. So people that are forced for economic reasons out of their immediate home communities due to neoliberal market globalization that has integrated the global economy. And yet they are offered no protections in that new place as migrants in many cases. They're not treated as citizens. They're not even given rights as migrants. And so one of the issues I'm very interested in of late, I'm writing a paper about, is the extent to which this new UN development of addressing a migrant rights document that will surface in 2018, this year in Morocco. The zero drafts are now available publicly, and I encourage you to read them, because what they speak to is the way of trying to surface a political order that matches the economic order that we now have. And we're a long way off. And many of these issues are political, and they demand some type of concerted action, and we're very weak at doing that. So I'm not saying it's going to surface a global state. I don't think that's a good idea, actually. But I do think this idea of governance, not government, Anne-Marie Slaughter's notion of governance, meaning structures like UNAI and other non-governmental sectors throughout the world that are doing work to surface ideas that say this is the way people should be treated when they're forced out of their homes economically, or when they're forced out due to inundations because of flood and ecological devastation, or when there's political strife and they can no longer be at home, such as in Syria, and then they're forced to flee. Then what happens? There's no political apparatus to address the issues of those, except for the Refugee Convention of the 1950s. But that's inadequate on a large scale, because much of this is economic that's causing these issues. So I want to also then put the happy frame up, because there's a lot to work for in the world, right? And I think it's very easy to lose sight of this, that we get focused on global issues and problems, and you read the daily newspaper and it's just way, way too much. And I've promised myself on this trip I'm not going to utter his name, the name of the man who works in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. now. I'm not going to utter his name, but it's a grinding effect on my mind to deal with that and Putin and all of it, constantly. I'm sure you feel the same way. It's overwhelming. And so we've got to keep in mind the preciousness of this planet, right? And the aesthetic wonder and beauty that is the world that we live in. It's really quite miraculous. And it's easy to lose sight of that. So I use this as a kind of orienting image to remind ourselves of the beauty that is both human created, right? So this is Venice. I was there recently, and it's really delightful. I mean, I had never been and seen it in pictures a million times, and then actually to visit and to walk, it's quite unbelievable, right? And you have to remember the sort of beauty of the planet. And then also Aurora Borealis, I've recently seen that as well in Canada, and I was like, wow, that's just, it's awe-inspiring. There's no way to describe it, really. And so to keep that sense of wonder, I go back to the teaching days when I was a high school teacher. I didn't have that insight. I didn't have that awareness. And for many kids, it was overwhelming, to deal with the wall of doom all of the time. And so I think as educators, we've got to keep in mind this kind of balance of the beauty that we are trying to uplift and uphold, the human flourishing therein that we wish to embrace, as well as a stern recognition of the kind of issues and problems that we face. Right? So it's not to ignore them and to make it all Pollyanna, but rather it's to kind of hold ideas synthetically at the same time. So big picture, that's what I have in mind in terms of doing this work. we're all familiar with these. I'm sure I won't spend much time on them. I think it is a very significant, though, achievement of the early generation of global scholars and people around the world doing this work to have 4.7 in this document, right? And it happened actually when we were here. I was here in 2015 when it was released, that the verbiage of this 4.7 would exist in this fashion. A number of us were saying in those years of the early MDG work, the Millennial Development Goals, that they were inadequate in that they were too literacy, numeracy, and access focused. Like education is about more, it is about that, but it's not just about that. It's also about sustainability, education for human rights, gender equality, culture of peace and global citizenship, and appreciation of diversity. So I was very happy to see this. Now the extent to which the UN can actually measure these is very problematic, we know, right? And so I'm looking forward to 2045 and see the next version of what these might look like and how they might be more fine-grained, more fine-tuned. We do have some interesting data that's coming about now through PISA. So we'll be curious to see how global competence gets measured and how that might map onto this work. But there's a lot more to be done, but I'm happy to say it's an achievement in the short term of what this movement of global citizenship ed, or GCED, has created in the wider world. So those are my orienting frames. I could spend a lot more time on this, but I won't. Just briefly to say that the conceptual dimensions matter, but also the practice matters, like what actually becomes of this work in practice. And so that's the kind of missing link, and that's what I'll spend most of my time talking about. So first, I want to talk about a school in Thailand that I spent some time with and did a case study on. It's the Marjun School, and it's based in the third ring outside of the center city of Bangkok. It's situated in a park-like setting. It's very aware of its surroundings in that the architecture of the space is created such that there's no stark division between the inside and the outside. The inside literally at times grows into the inside, and the outside is always sort of commingling with the inside. So there's inside, outside. There's no stark division. There are big open windows, and then the trees are right outside of these windows, and all of this was purposeful. Because the founders of this institution said there is too much modernization and dislocation from the natural world for children to develop an appreciation of the biodiversity of the planet. And so they made a concerted effort to build the structure to teach them that in their daily lives. And it's really quite lovely. I mean, it's one of the most serene schools I've ever visited. Schools can be kind of hectic and feel like anxiety producing, even for adults, certainly for young people. My son shares this. My son's a 15-year-old and he goes to a public high school in New Jersey. And he shares the anxiety of going to school, right? That sort of pit in your stomach of like thousands of kids converging in this large building and a lot of what this school does is in a contemplative way, focus on developing the inner self and a kind of peaceful, tranquil setting in which for this work to occur. And I think that's a very important piece because in GCED we often project big ideas, global issues, like international concerns, geopolitics, and we lose sight of the development of the inner self and how very important that is. And I think it speaks to very much a kind of Thai culture that sees the cultivation of the inner self as crucial to the development of a full being. So along those lines, they have a very strong orientation towards process. So everything they do in the school is about process. I'll point out two of these images. The lower left is a rice paddy that the kids built themselves, and they grow their own rice. And they do this through a long semester of study of how rice horticulture works. They then do an externship where these city kids, right, these cosmopolitan city kids from Bangkok, go to the rural southern part of the country into the rice paddies and spend 2 weeks actually raising the crop with rice farmers. Now, very interestingly, the intentions of the faculty is not just to teach them about rice farming, of course. It's to teach them about interdependence and the complexity of this webbed world that we live in. And at the same time, they're trying to address social class because these kids are paying a lot of money to attend this school. So this is a relatively elite school in the context of Bangkok. And now they're going to a very rural, poor area where it's all farmers, and they're having a very different experience of what Thailand looks like here. So they're learning about interdependence, but they're also learning about class within the context of this society. They also have student lunch groups, which I found fascinating. So the kids prepare lunch for each other. They go out and they prepare the ingredients, they make the food, and then they serve each other. And they rotate in committees so that everyone's either on a setup committee, a cleanup committee, a preparation committee, a cooking committee, and they rotate over the course of the whole year. So it's very communal, and it builds into the sort of fabric of the work. Not everyone, and I remember vividly, I went to this school, I spent a week and a half there, and it was delightful. I wanted to stay. I told them, I said, I want to stay. I want to leave my job at Columbia and stay here. It was so enriching. And then I went home and I went to get lunch. And I remember with my tray, and everyone's packed in, the space. Everyone's packed into this little space. And I'm like, this is so wrong. This is why we're not cultivating our inner selves. So anyway, I think you get the idea. The last one I'll point out is this Buddha statue. It is Buddhist in its orientation. There are 3 Buddha statues, but they're not just made there. And the teacher who described this project is quite lovely. She said, it'd be one thing for us to go and buy one. It's another thing entirely to teach the kids the process of making one. And then they actually went through that whole process, and then they brought it to India to have it blessed, and then they returned it to campus. Right? So again, it shows you the social class dimension. They were able to take a trip to India to do this. It wasn't cheap, but they learned the process of making. So she said, our ethos of the school is nothing should just appear on campus. Things should always be processual in its origins. It's deeply Deweyan and Montessorian informed in the way it thinks about education. I could say a lot more about that. The last piece I'll mention is meditative practice. So they do a lot of this self-cultivation and meditative practice. In fact, the lead faculty member whom I worked with was one of my visits when I was arriving. He had just come off a 7-day retreat in utter silence of meditation. And I was thinking, wow, it's very impressive, and I'm positive I couldn't do it, but I'm very impressed by that. And again, it's a focus on the cultivation of the self. So that's one example. It's an outlier for sure, but I think this is a form of global citizenship, even though it's not the projective type. They do learn about global warming, they learn about hydroculture, they learn about raising crops and all those kinds of things. But again, it's very much rooted in self-development. Similarly, in Hawaii, and this is the Liliha program. So this is community-based with university structure. I'll talk about this for a bit. So this is a sustainability project in Liliha Farms, and it is on the leeward or the dry side of the main island, Oahu. And so the important thing about this is that we think of Hawaii and we think of a tourist destination. This is as far from a tourist destination as you could possibly be. It's like a 2.5-hour ride off of the main part of the tourist area into the very poor area of Hawaii that most tourists will never see. And again, the leeward side, the dry side of the island, therefore very difficult to raise crops there. So the fact that they have a highly productive farm, by the way, that grosses $1 million annually, that is completely run by young people. Completely. And so this young person, the guy in this picture, it's hard to see here, but he was a member of this community. He dropped out of school, he got involved in drugs and all sorts of bad things. I'll never forget the quote he said in our conversations. He said, when you're in a bad situation, a bad context, really dumb ideas sound like good ones. And so I learned that as a child, as a young person. So he later went on to become appointed to the advisor for President Barack Obama's White House initiative on organic farming. So he moved from being a dropout from high school, drug addicted, to the seats of power. Very interesting sort of trajectory. Fascinating guy. He talks about, this is a program again for 17 to 24-year-olds. They're learning about social entrepreneurship, heritage, and society through this program. They're doing it in such a way where they have a 3-2 program. So 3 days a week, they're running the farm, all aspects of it. Production, distribution, growing the crops, everything that you have to deal with, right? So very rooted, literally. And then 2 days a week, they're at a university studying. Again, these are at-risk kids. So these are kids that otherwise would have dropped out or have dropped out of school. They have an internal tribunal. So if there are kids that are engaging in drug use or other behaviors inappropriate within this context, the kids themselves decide what the punishment or the appropriate ameliorative justice should be for the student. So it's very much a woven kind of community in that sense. And they're also global ambassadors in that they're doing agricultural sustainability work in other contexts. So this becomes a case study for other communities where otherwise kids would not have opportunities to connect. So another illustration. The last one in terms of the non-university, and then I'll move into university exclusively, is Darpali, which is in Mumbai. And this is a school network that is run by a non-governmental. And Darpali runs this after-school program for kids that are living in the most dire situations in some respects, most dire situations in India. They're living in abject poverty. There's no potable water that's available to them. They're living in shanties or temporary housing. They've come from far away in many cases, and they're relocated here. And then they're doing this after-school program, both for English language learning, so to give them a point of access or entry into the world, and also they're doing this after-school program, which is about civic engagement. And in this particular one, they're learning the model of social inquiry. So they're taking problems, they're interviewing local people, and then they're saying, like, what are the issues that you're dealing with? And they're collecting data, they're learning about how to produce that data, and then they're connecting them with other NGOs in Mumbai who are doing work on those particular issues. Sex trafficking, for example, is a big one. So one of the days I happened to be visiting with them, they had an NGO that was being started up by the daughters of sex workers. And they were taking these kids and bringing them in to introduce them to the whole group of after-school children, although they only focused on the secondary kids for obvious reasons. And they were doing this in such a way because they wanted to illustrate that the challenges that these young women face, they were highly stigmatized within their community. And when the kids found out, I was there at the big reveal, when they found out, they didn't know who these kids were. Like, they're just an NGO, they're going to talk to you later. And then over time, they developed a sort of pedagogy that allowed it to be revealed who they were. They didn't believe it. They were stunned. And I think what it did was addressing a global issue, but it was doing it in such a way that was actually meaningful to the people who were there in the room. Like, it was the way the global issue was affecting them, and the stigmatization that was occurring. So amazing learning at a very sort of risky pedagogical moment that occurred in this particular program. So they're trying to get the kids kind of aware of the larger society and aware of the kind of challenges that it confronts, and the way that they are connected to it. So most of these kids don't have access to clean water. The teachers know that. They asked them one day, they're like, how many of you have access to clean water every day? And every hand shot up to say yes. And the teachers were telling me this, they're like, we all knew it wasn't true, because they live in a slum. There is no access to clean water. And then finally they're like, no, how many of you have clean water? And they're like, oh, yes, we do. And like, eventually they figured out, the kids said, every day, for 1 hour, they turn on a tap and we go bring our bucket and we fill it up, and that's our access to clean water. So that's the kind of deprivation that we're talking about within this context. But when you meet the kids, it's amazing. The ability for these kids to do wonderful things in this community, despite being the poorest of the poor in Mumbai, very significant. So again, detailed that in the book. I dealt with a lot of, in this particular book, a lot of kids in circumstances on the lower end of the economic strata, because my argument is that we have got to do GSED in those communities. I mean, it's very common to find it in elite private schools, like in New York City, I'm sure in Seoul. It's very uncommon to find it in the poorest schools. And I would argue those kids need it the most. They're the most vulnerable to the challenges of global concerns, whether they're aware of it or not. So we owe it to them to educate them about the circumstances they confront. So I won't spend much time on this, but this is obviously, this is a cartogram or a visual representation of proportionality that shows the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. And so you can see the parts of the world where that's very significant and where that's a number of people and where that's very, very few. So just to illustrate that kind of dimension. So this is now all universities. So I'm going to start with teacher ed that I know best and then move from that. First is Midlands. So Midlands is a university in the upper Midwest of the United States. And they have a cohort program for teacher ed. So they have a global cohort. And basically the idea is that they try to give these beginning teachers an experience with otherness through the academic program, so that when they teach and they engage with kids who, let's say, might be a newly arrived kid from Syria, or a student that speaks no English and is originally from Guatemala and speaking Spanish, like they do that in a way that's sensitive and aware of the cultural difference and ameliorative, in a sense, tries to help the kids. So it's very focused on kind of classroom and K-12 work and how you can do the best in the service of kids who are different, quote unquote. Now, in the upper Midwest of the United States, you have a significant demographic shift that's occurring. Communities that used to be entirely white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon, maybe Southern European, Eastern European stock are now largely Latino, increasingly Latino, kids of the Middle East, kids from really around the world. And so they're diversifying communities rapidly. That's happening in these communities, and it's changing the dynamic. And it helps explain how that person got into the Oval Office, right? That's going to remain nameless today. Because these people are very anxious and fearful of the society they feel like they have lost as a result of the diversification, particularly in those quote-unquote red states of the US. So that's part of the dynamic. And they're very much aware of that here in the school that I visited, where they're the chief partners with this university, where they're doing teacher ed work. They have a kind of purposeful intention of addressing those political issues through the lens of the experience of the kids in the classroom who have actually migrated from some of these places. So it's challenging work for sure, and it can be quite controversial in these communities where they otherwise see this as very frightening, right? Globalization is very fearful, something to be very anxious about. So the other one is Torg University in Ontario. And they have a more kind of critical edge. And if you think about your stereotype of Canadians versus Americans, I think it's fitting, actually. So Americans tend to be less sort of Marxist-informed, critical, socialistic, and Canadians more so. And this discourse is definitely taken up differently in teacher ed here. So teacher ed at Torg is very sharply critical. It's about systemic violence against poor people and trying to address the ways in which teachers should be concerned with those issues and trying to address them. Whereas the other one is more like, I would describe as kind of happy diversity, right? Everyone's different and that's okay. And they're trying to teach kids about that type of difference, which I think is good, right? It's ameliorative, it's good. But Torg has a more critical, systemic approach to the way in which neoliberalism, global marketplaces have created these kind of pockets of significant despair in the world. And so they address those issues directly. They have a cohort model, and they have a trouble, both of these schools have troubles with inclusion and exclusion. And you'll get this immediately, right? So we're part of the global group, all of us, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's other people working over there, they're not part of the global group. But they are part of the global group because everyone's part of the global group. So where do you draw this line of these are the global people and these are the non or aglobal people, right? This inclusion, exclusion. And the faculty in both cases really struggle with this idea of why are we excluding people in the college from the work that we believe should include the entire planet, but not those people in that office. Right? So these are the ways institutional politics intersect with this discourse of GSED at a high level. So some of the challenges there. I thought I'd talk for a moment about the course I teach, since you want university examples. And so I teach a course that's not a required course at Teachers College Columbia. Raina sat in on it last year and helped teach it for a month or so while she was with us. And we offered again this spring, offer it on a regular basis. And I'll tell you briefly about what we're trying to do in the course. I'm trying to get them inside the heads of people who are writing about all these big ideas like globalization, global issues and problems, the refugee crises, et cetera, migrancy, these concerns of the day. And so I'm getting them into like the literature, if you will, of global thinking. So everyone from Jeffrey Sachs to Martha Nussbaum, Riva Jaffe Walter, and Chandra Mohanty. The nice thing about this group is that many of them are at Columbia's campus periodically. So, Joe Stiglitz teaches there, right? So does Jeffrey Sachs. So we can always get to a public event and say, go see them live. Actually, Chandra Mohanty, we just read her last week, and she was on campus. I'm like, this is perfect. It's trying to, got Gitari Spivak, another person actually, And it's interesting because Columbia is a very big university, and I'm at Teachers College, and that's in New York we joke that's the largest avenue in Manhattan, the distance between Columbia and Teachers College. So there's a lot to be said there. But people like Yatari Spivak, I happened to see her in the faculty lounge the other day, and I was like, hey, I think I know you. It was kind of funny. But again, they do public talks, and so students have access to them and the ideas. So I give them kind of orientation to globalization discourse. And then in the course itself, it's focused on how do you pivot and take some of these critical concerns and issues and bring them into the lives of kids, whether it's in a higher ed setting or a K-12 setting. And so we have about 20 students that enroll in this course. Fascinating to me too in that I always have students from Korea, from Hong Kong, from mainland China, from Taiwan, from Japan, always Asia is incredibly well represented in this population. I think it says something to how GSED is sort of a higher profile issue, in the context of some Asian societies compared to the United States. And that actually creates a really lovely opportunity for learning for us in this course. What do? We do a lot of seminar discussion and leadership. So students lead discussions and I lead discussions around these core works. Some of it's small groups, some is online. A lot of video and response. And then lastly, we do global outings. And so I'll say a bit about that. The global outings is where they pair up with someone where they're an insider to an identity and the other person is an outsider to that identity. And then they pair up. And so they'll take the person to an event. It might be a meeting of the Communist Party. One of our students did that. It might be to a gay bar. It might be to a Korean restaurant. It might be to any number of places in the city that represent their identity, where they're the insider. And then they flip roles, and the other person is the outsider, and they're the insider. It's a delightful activity in that they then report both learning about something they never knew about. Like has no context of understanding in Israel. He literally did not understand the game. And he's asking questions, and I'm trying to explain baseball to him. And it's very difficult when you're naturally like a viewer of baseball. How do I explain why they're running to first base? I don't know. They got a hit. Well, why didn't you run to second base? Well, you have to run to first before you go to second. It's a very odd conversation. But it's helped me to appreciate my sort of baseball insider knowledge in the same sense of that internal-external dynamic. The other piece of it is that we place our students in high-need schools in New York City. So if these are teacher ed students, some of them are, they're being placed in the South Bronx, in the Lower East Side, in Hell's Kitchen, in Queens, in Brooklyn, etc., where they're going to face some very challenging circumstances. They will be working in schools where I guarantee you they did not attend those schools. Right? And it's a completely different sort of cultural world that they're entering. It's a very valuable experience, I argue, although I've had to argue with some parents about these placements, as you could probably imagine, as an administrator. But by doing that, we are giving them an opportunity to see inside the lives of kids, issues they would never imagine, such as DACA kids. So this one student, Amanda, grew up on the Upper East Side. She, by her own admission, very wealthy, a privileged life, and she's working at school now on the Lower East Side. This was 2 years ago, where she's working with a lot of kids who every day read the newspaper to hear what's going on with DACA, or these, the Dreamer discussion that's going on in the United States about the deportation of kids who came to the United States through no fault of their own, undocumented because of their parents, and now grew up there, have never known anything but living in Manhattan, let's say, or living in Queens, and now they're going to be deported. Again, it's very shocking, and again, it's that point about our economic changes have not matched our political changes. There's a fundamental disconnect, and these kids are the rub of that disconnect. So she documents their lives and the struggle, the daily struggle of having to follow the news to see if you're going to be deported to live in a place where you really have no knowledge or recollection of. So, and then this is a little thing where I pulled out one of the papers that the student wrote, but they did a Jewish Catholic experience. And they were talking about how this idea where I learned more about my Judaism through taking someone who's Catholic to explain to them Judaism, right? So teaching is the best form of teaching, and knowing rather. So that's one example of my own example of the kind of work I do on GSED. A quick overview on universities. I want to turn to Raina on her section of this, but I will briefly talk about my colleague Emiliano Bosio, who teaches at Yokohama in Japan. And he's also he was a visiting scholar with us like Rena was last year. Emiliano was here this year. And he's doing a study of university programs that are GSED programs. So if you're interested, you can follow up. I mentioned this to Emiliano, and he said it was fine. Follow up with him by email, and I can put you in touch. A lot of these are still cases that are in development. But what I like what he's doing is he's trying to take a really broad swath of programming that's going on in the world and describe it in relationship to each other while giving depth to the individual cases. So these are some of those. But yet, there's a big fear of the global. I've already mentioned this. I'll just say a little bit more about it. So we have this program. Oh, I didn't get that slide, sorry. It's up here. And it's an online program for educators that is geared, and we have university as well as K-12 educators in the program, that's geared towards the idea, really the idea of my Russian experience. Like, if you want people to like get the global, you've got to put them else somewhere else, and you've got to teach them about what's going on, because their education, for the most part, has not addressed these concerns. And so we developed a program with many short courses online. And these courses are offered via a variety of professors that we have, and they're offered online, and there are synchronous sessions. So they actually meet online for 2 hours where everyone's like visually online together and actually talking despite the distance. And then there are other times where it's completely done asynchronously. So that's the program. We were sussing around with the New York Times for a while. A reporter was like kind of checking the program out and was curious about it. And then someone got elected, and he decided he wanted to do a story about it. Now, I wonder how that happened. So this is February 8th, 2017, which is just 3 weeks after the inauguration, that David Bornstein ran this article called Preparing Young Americans for a Complex World. So basically, it is a story about the program and about the teachers, so you can check it out. I'll send it to you. When this was coming out, a colleague of mine heard about it and said, "Oh, congratulations on the New York Times piece." And he's like, "Whatever you do, Bill, do not read the comment section." And I'm like, he put the thought in my head. Of course, I already had the thought. And I'm like, okay. He's like, "I'm telling you, don't read the comment section. You don't want to do it." And what did I do? The morning the story was published, I read the comment section, and there are the comments. Well, there are hundreds of comments, but these are illustrative. So actually, I turned into a little study. My doctoral student and I did a kind of terrain analysis of what the comments were like, and these typify the kind of comments that came out. So there's John Brown in Idaho writing, "This reminds me how the rich kids took French in school," right? This is the elitist argument, the global elitist argument. Next one. This is our cheerleader in Boston, Maureen, saying, "You know, good for you that we're trying to stop the insularity and isolation of the United States with a program that works with kids. So count me in as a coastal elite." So this was the time where a lot of people were criticizing, the loss of Hillary was because of the coastal elites ignored, and there's something to that argument. There is something to that argument in terms of the economic changes. I think maybe my favorite is the third one. My experience with Americans, they're really nice people, but they're very ignorant about the world around them. C'est dommage. It's a shame, right? Of course, offered in French as a sort of dig at the monolinguality of the United States. I love that from our friends in Ottawa. And then lastly, this is the most concerning one, Ivor. "I drive 10 miles back and forth to work each day. Beyond that, I don't care. Why should I? For I beyond that do not exist." Really? Like, does he really believe that? I wish Ivor was here. Maybe we should go reach out to Ivor. We should do an intervention. So in Pasadena, California, believes that the whole world exists in 10 miles. And that's all he cares about. Although I think that reflects an attitude of many people, that doesn't matter to me. I actually think about my family members. My family, none of my family travel anywhere ever. Like, none of them own a passport. And it's always shocking to me. And it's just as shocking to me as it is to them, because they'll hear about, like, "Oh, I was in Seoul and I was in Tokyo." They're like, "What do you do over there? Why are you going there?" Like, it's so weird to them that I do this work. And to me, it's the opposite. It's so weird to me that they don't ever leave. But maybe it's a personality difference. I don't know. I can't really explain it. My brother and I grew up in the exact same house, right? Same family, etc. And, I've done a lot of work globally. That's my life. and he literally never leaves. Like, he built a house a mile from where we grew up, and that's it. And literally, that's his world. He'd never even been to New York City, and it was only about 80 miles away. But that's just hard for me to believe. Like, anyway, so I don't want to digress into my family, but that's attitude, I think, that comes from there. So I was sort of playing with this idea of, like, what might Korean GSED look like? And I happened to be at a conference in Toronto 2 weeks back, and you might think I do nothing but travel. This is the end of my travel this week. But I heard a talk by Robin Citizens, a delightful young woman who's an independent scholar there, and she was looking at gastrodiplomacy. And since I was giving this talk here, I'm like, oh, Robin, can I borrow some of your slides? They're really cool. So get in touch with her if you want to learn more about her research. But it basically explores the ways in which Korea is actively exporting itself in a kind of global moment around food. So they're thinking about gastrodiplomacy. Now you may remember this. You probably do remember this, okay? The idea that globalization is underpinned by Koreanization. And so, again, the fear of the loss of identity, I think, is a big part of what people fear in global, as well as the kind of affinity. And I was talking actually with Han Chung-hee about this, who's the U.S. consular ambassador to the UN. And we became quite close. So we would go to lunch together and talk about these things. And the most recent one, when he was leaving New York, was around this idea of, like, what can we do to, like, get this embedded in schools, in the life of kids? And I'm like, part of the problem is you don't have a sense of connection to global. Like, a global citizen, I don't even call myself that, and I do this work. Like, it's just something that doesn't connect and resonate in a way that being Korean does. So I do think that's a kind of affiliative work that educators have to do. How do we build a sense of affiliation to these amorphous ideas? And I'll talk more about that on when I get to the last part of the talk. So this is culinary nation branding, or gastrodiplomacy. And it's more than just using meals to facilitate negotiations. It's also a way of communicating culture through food. And it's very interesting. The last time I was in Korea 2 years back, and I was visiting, and then it was the week I was back home, and I was getting up at like 3 in the morning, adjusting for my jet lag. And I took myself down to the beach to walk on the boardwalk, and I saw all these little Korean restaurants that had opened up, like these shops. And I was very curious, and they were Korean people who were making the food, and they're like, why'd you do this? And they're like, oh, I don't know, I just really like Korean food, so I figured I'd open a place on the beach. It was very curious to see. And then I realized now it was part of actually a diplomatic effort on the part of Korea to raise its profile vis-a-vis other global foods, like Thai food, or like Japanese, or Italian food, right? So, again, you're all nodding, so you already know this. I did not know this, but I think it would be a really interesting mechanism to engage university students in this whole play of ideas of how gastrodiplomacy works and why Koreanization ought to undergird globalization. What does that mean? And how is it mediated? And that's the part I want to share with you. Do you know this series?
안녕하십니까, 황금혜입니다. 너 마음만 되돌릴 수 있다면 나 못할 일이 없어.
거기 김치는 말이에요. 한국 사람이 먹이는 것 같지가 않고 호텔에서 술이 너무 같아요. 우리 음식은 우리의 방식대로 만들어야 최고가 아닌가 싶은데.
Do you know this K-drama? No? Okay. You might. I think you get the idea of it, though. It's called Immortal Classic. And basically, it is sort of the K-drama formula using the culinary fight between two families over the authentic cuisine and the export of that authentic cuisine. So I think as a sort of vehicle, it might be interesting to use this as a text to explore the ideas of globalization and mediation and how they manifest in K-drama. I always try to go with things that, and this might not really be popular here in this context now, but things that kids are already talking about and thinking about, and try to explore the ways in which the global dimensionality is present within those. So, interesting in the points of appeal of this, they do it on 3 levels. So there's the affect, which appeals to the sense of nostalgia around food. And again, this is Robin's work in her analysis. She watched the entire series and did a textual analysis of the work. The medicinal pieces of it, such as the expository dialogue, where whenever an ingredient is introduced, it's sort of explained like why it's valuable medicinally. Again, to export the idea of food. And then lastly, the novelty of it. The images of the dish and the aesthetic nature of the dishes themselves and the way in which they're constructed. So I think it's working because I'm seeing Korean food everywhere I go now, and every time I do now, I'm like, huh, now it's not just here, it's everywhere that this is happening. Okay, so I think one possibility. So I want to conclude by saying some of the insights that I think that draw generally from this work, and I think I will then wrap up and open for some discussion and turn it over to Raina. But the first is, my first order of business as a scholar is really to address and engage with the north-south gaps that exist. And I think it's really crucial that we not ignore that. And we ignore it at our peril. This is Joseph Stiglitz's commentary on the election. And he's like, you know, in some ways the critique that the left is to blame for this election is true, in that it knew neoliberal globalization was having a deleterious effect on a lot of communities in the US and across the planet, right? And it basically said, well, too bad. You know, it didn't address it. And there's a lot of anger over that. There is a lot of anger directed towards elites. And so I think we and I would say we are elites, whether we want that title or not, we have got to address those discrepancies, those occlusions that exist around these issues. And one way to do it is to work in schools where kids would otherwise never have access to these ideas. It's very easy just to go to international school and to talk about GSED. You'll always find a willing audience. And kids that, you know, are traveling to, you know, Brunei and then to Indonesia and then on to wherever. But that's not the audience. Like the audience I want to work with are the kids in the South Bronx, where they literally never left the South Bronx. As hard as that is to believe, there are kids growing up in the Bronx, a borough of New York City, that have never been to Manhattan, which is a $2.50 ride away on a subway, and yet have never been. So those kinds of issues exist in all places around the world, and we've got to pay attention to them as educators and as scholars, and in our research for sure. The other one is the opening up of the exclusivity of global discourses. I think that's a problem in all of our institutions, where we create these global centers. I was just at a conference in Tokyo where everyone was an officer from a global center of various universities. And my first question to many of them was, what are you doing to get the non-global people involved? And they kind of looked at me strange. I'm like, you know, we got to get out of this club idea that it's not just our club, it's everyone is engaged. If this is really global work, it's got to engage with everyone. It's got to open to everyone. And then how do you plan and sustain programmatic efforts? You know, I was talking with Professor Kim about the founding of this new center, and that's a great thing. And then how do you sustain that over the next 50 years? Like, how do you grow it in such a way that it really becomes integral to the work of the whole campus? Because many of the initiatives now in this book that's now in data collection only 6 years old, many of them are closed. Like the programs don't exist anymore. Not all of them, I can tell you which one blow by blow. Some of them still do, some of them have morphed, others have completely gone, like they just don't exist. So that's an important piece to think about institutionally. How do you sustain a meaningful effort that's actually grounded and people see it as important to the regular work that they're doing? So let me stop on this idea of habit of everyday transcendence. I don't know anymore that this is possible, but this is my idea of what I was trying to argue in the book. So how do we come to the kind of presence of knowledge that everything at this table and everything on our bodies and every device that we happen to have are completely, in the material sense, generated from this planet in multifarious ways that we can't possibly understand all the time? And how do we keep that sort of thought ever present, not just in the material space, but also in the idiospace, or drawing on Apatriz's work, the idiosphere, or the way in which ideas travel around the planet, or in the mediosphere, in the way in which text and knowledge travels around the planet. Like, how do we keep that presence of mind that we are deeply interwoven and interconnected on the planet? And I don't know how to do it, but that's the challenge, I think, for GSED. is to both explore with people how they're interconnected, to go to that guy in California and say, hey dude, the world's bigger than 10 miles. Despite your not knowing that, it is. And how do we educate that person for it? But then also, how do we ourselves keep that awareness in our daily life? How do we habitualize that awareness? And so I use this image, which I grew up with, which is historically known as the crying Indian, right? So this image was used. So in the US, for a lot of years, if you were done with a bottle, you opened the window in your car and you threw it out. Oops, sorry. I didn't mean to actually throw it. Open the window. And that was so normal. I can't begin to tell you. I remember as a kid doing that. I'm embarrassed and ashamed to admit that, but I did that as a kid. Like, we would just open the window and toss it out on the road. And my dad, who's since passed, but was 75 when he passed, he still did it until like very recently. And I would always yell at him. He's like, shut up. I'm like, Dad, don't you remember the crying Indian? So in a sense, this image, and basically it was someone was doing that and threw something on the side of the road, and it fell at the feet of this Native American looking person, who was not Native American, by the way, who was actually Sicilian. Very odd, and that also tells you about the era in which this was done, that you would have a Sicilian stand in for someone who was, he actually married a Native American woman, had children, raised them as Native American, but he was actually the and it created this kind of like profound media moment that everyone shared. So if you ask people my age and even somewhat younger, they'll be like, oh yeah, of course I know the crying Indian. Everyone knows the crying Indian. Because it changed a mentality, like shifted a mentality about the world. So in a sense, after that, like, kids didn't throw things out windows anymore. It shifted people's mindset. Can we create that with respect to this global world? Like that idea, like shifting people's perception. I don't know, but I hope so. I think we need to. And this is Dewey's idea of interest. So Dewey's idea of interest is that being, this very difficult idea, right? Philosophers spend a lifetime and never get to sort of understanding fully what it means. But this idea of being is fundamentally interactional and relational, always, all the time, across the planet. And our interest is our sense of being connected to that being, right? That our being is wound in the being of other people. And I often talk about this in my own work, that I'll say, oh, that's my book. It's not my book. Those ideas are from countless other people and interactions and experiences. So I get the credit for it. My name's on the title, but it's not really my book. It's a compilation of the interrelationship that we all exist within. And so that's Dewey's notion. So everything potentially is of interest. If you look at this book by Lee Benner, I highly recommend it. It's called Blood Oil. And in that all of our products and resources are a product of that interrelationship. And so that's what I'm hoping for. And I think Martin Luther King said it best. I'll give you a moment of this. He gave that speech on Christmas Eve in 1967, actually very near his campus at the Morningside Chapel, 3 months before he was assassinated. And he had just returned recently from a trip to India where he encountered for the first time the reality that his oppression as a black Southern man was not unique to his experience and the experience of his brothers and sisters. That, in fact, there were people on the other side of the planet, the untouchables, lower castes within India, that were experiencing just the same type of oppression. And that was a profound moment because I think in some ways it sort of triggered the global understanding that King had, that the concerns of oppression were not unique to those people. They really were shared by lots of people around the world. And I think keeping that idea of interrelationship in everything that we do is the kind of challenge of GSET on a very broad level. Maybe looking at K-dramas is a way into that conversation, but that's not the whole of it, of course. The study of it can never be reduced to that. Fundamentally, it's a movement towards interrelationship and understanding of our interbeing. That's the big picture of what I think GSET stands for. So with that, I think I'll stop. And thank you all for your apt attention. Thanks.